All right, let's go. Number 10. The Norse the year is 1643. Brynjolfur Sveinsson, Bishop of Squilholt in Iceland, receives a manuscript. He doesn't know who found it or where it had been kept in the decades before it reached him, only that it is very old and that it contains poems. He has it catalogued as Codex Regius, the King's Book, and eventually sends it to Copenhagen, where it will sit in the Royal Danish Library for 330 years before Reykjavik formally requests its return. Scholars who analyze the manuscript establish that its contents are far older than the 13th century document itself. The poems it preserves were composed and transmitted orally across generations before being written down. The oldest and most significant of them is the Vlusp, the Sibyl's prophecy. A Vilva, a Norse seeress, narrating what she saw when she looked across the entire span of time, from the creation of the world to its end. What she describes at the end demands attention. Fimbulwinter, 3 winters with no summer between them. The text describes a progressive sequence. First the sun grows dim. Then crops fail across the land. Then ash begins to fall from the sky. Then cold, unlike any ordinary winter, settles in and does not lift. 3 years of it. No growing season. Animals dying. People dying. The social structures of the world, the Norse framework of kinship, oath, and contract, dissolving as survival overrides everything. And then, Surtur fares from the south with the scourge of branches. The son of the slaughter gods shines from his sword, crags topple, and troll wives are abroad, men tread the road to hell, and heaven is rent in twain. Surtur, the fire giant of the south, comes with something burning from his weapon so intense it tears the sky in two. Then the sky goes dark. Then the stars fall. Fire consumes the earth from below and above, and then the sea rises over everything. This is Ragnarok, the end of the world. Scholars have traditionally treated it as mythology, cosmological imagination, not historical record. But in 2016, a study changed the framework around Fimbulwinter. Ulf Bentgen of the Swiss Federal Research Institute WSL and colleagues published research in Nature Geoscience, identifying the year 536 C as the beginning of the most severe and sustained climate disruption in the past 2,000 years. Analysis of tree rings, ice cores, and cave deposits across Europe, Asia, and the Americas converged on a single finding, beginning in 536 CE. And continuing through a second event in 540 C and a third in 547 C, a series of volcanic eruptions injected massive amounts of particulate matter into the stratosphere. The result was an atmospheric veil that blocked sunlight for 18 months following the first eruption. Summer temperatures dropped across Europe and Asia to their coldest levels in 2 millennia. Crops failed. Famine followed. Plague followed the famine. The Greenland ice cores preserve the chemical signature of this event in layers of sulfuric aerosol deposited from the stratospheric injection. Michael McCormick, economic historian at Harvard University and co-author of the Nature Geoscience study, gave this assessment in a 2018 interview with Science. 536 C was the beginning of one of the worst periods to be alive, if not the worst year in the last 2,000 years. Fimbulwinter, 3 consecutive winters without summer, crops failing, ash falling from the sky, matches the onset conditions of a nuclear winter or impact winter event with precision, stratospheric particulate loading, reduced solar radiation reaching the surface, cascading agricultural failure, social breakdown. The Vlusp is not a climate record, but it is describing something that left a measurable chemical signature in ice cores 14 centuries later. Surtur's fire, arriving from the south, tearing the sky, remains unexplained. The Norse seeress placed the beginning of the catastrophe in a specific direction. So did almost every other culture on this list. Quick one before number 9. If you want to go deeper on the physical evidence behind these ancient accounts, actual excavations, named archaeologists, datable artifacts, I wrote a 60-page ebook on the archaeological evidence confirming the Bible. Link is in the description. Back to it. Number 9. The Greeks around 590 BCE. Solon of Athens, lawgiver, poet, one of the 7 sages of ancient Greece, visits Egypt. He is received by the priests at the Temple College at Sas, in the western Nile Delta. One of the senior priests engages him in a conversation about history, and the priest tells Solon something that is startling enough that it goes into his notes, and from his notes into the work of Plato, who uses it as the opening frame for his cosmological dialogues Timaeus and Critias. Plato sets it down in Timaeus at sections 22c through 23b. This is not a footnote in Plato. These dialogues contain his most ambitious attempt to describe the physical nature of the universe and the origins of civilization. The conversation at Sas is his opening premise. The Egyptian priest says this: "There have been many destructions of mankind. The greatest come from 2 sources, fire and water. Fire comes from above, water comes from below. The earth has been destroyed by both at different times, and will be again." Then the priest offers a specific example. He says, "There is a story that once upon a time Phaethon, the son of Helios, having yoked the steeds in his father's chariot, because he was not able to drive them in the path of his father, burnt up all that was upon the earth, and was himself destroyed by a thunderbolt." Now this has the form of a myth, but really signifies a declination of the bodies moving in the heavens around the earth, and a great conflagration of things upon the earth recurring at long intervals of time. The priest is explicit. The Phaethon story is not mythology. It has the form of myth, but it signifies something real, a declination of celestial bodies, and the consequent burning of the earth. Then he goes further. He tells Solon that the Greeks are always children. They have no memory of these events, because Greek civilization keeps being wiped out and restarted. The Egyptians survived because of the Nile. When fire comes from above, the floodplain's water extinguishes it. When the sea rises, the high desert survives. The Egyptian temple archives, he says, have preserved records going back to the very beginning. The phrase declination of the bodies moving in the heavens around the earth is not poetic language. Declination was a precise technical term in ancient Greek and Egyptian astronomy. It described the angular deviation of a celestial body from its expected path. In astronomical usage, a declination event was a measured deviation, an object moving outside its predicted orbit. The Egyptian priest is using a technical astronomical term to describe the cause of a fire from above. He is not describing the Phaethon myth as metaphor for the sun. He is describing a specific kind of object, deviating from its expected path, entering the atmosphere. Victor Klube, working at the Royal Observatory Edinburgh, and Bill Napier at Armagh Observatory in Northern Ireland, published The Cosmic Serpent in 1982 and The Cosmic Winter in 1990. Their thesis, developed across 2 books and a series of papers in academic journals, including Quarterly Journal of the Royal Astronomical Society, was that a class of ancient catastrophe narratives preserved in Greek, Egyptian, and other Mediterranean literature encoded the memory of real cosmic impact and atmospheric airburst events, events involving the debris train of a large fragmented comet intersecting with the Earth's orbit at various points in prehistory and early history. The Timaeus passage, Klube and Napier argued, was among the strongest cases, a text in which a named historical source explicitly reframes a well-known mythological narrative as historical fact and uses astronomical vocabulary to describe the mechanism. The priest's account contains one more element. He distinguishes explicitly between destruction by fire from above and destruction by flood from below, treating them as separate events, different causes, different times, different survivors. The same cultures appear in both categories. The same thing that burned also flooded, at a different moment. The catastrophe record kept in the Egyptian temples contained both. The unsettling detail is not the story, it is who is telling it. An Egyptian priest in the 6th century BC is correcting a Greek philosopher, citing temple records older than Greek civilization, about how many times the world had been set on fire from above, and treating this as institutional memory, as documented history, as something the archive contained proof of. He was a librarian. He was citing files, and the records in those files described something that no one has fully explained since. Number 8. The Codex Chimalpopoca is a collection of Nahuatl manuscripts compiled in early colonial Mexico, surviving from a period when indigenous scholars were still preserving pre-Columbian knowledge under Spanish rule. The collection includes the Leyenda de los Soles, the Legend of the Suns, which contains the Aztec account of how the world has been created and destroyed multiple times. Alfonso Caso, the Mexican archaeologist whose systematic work on Aztec calendar correlation and codex interpretation through the middle of the 20th century remains central to the field, analyzed these texts in depth. The scholarly English edition was published in 1992 by John Bierhorst through the University of Arizona Press, with extensive footnotes on textual variants and scholarly interpretation. The Aztec cosmological framework is not a creation myth in the simple sense. It is a theory of history. The universe has been created and destroyed not once but 5 times, and the present world is the 5th. Each creation is called a sun. Each sun ends differently. The 4th sun ended in flood, destroyed by water rising over the land. That catastrophe is covered in a previous script on this channel in the context of flood traditions across ancient civilizations. The 3rd sun is different. Its name is Nahui Quiahuitzil, 4 rain in the Aztec day sign calendar, and the Leyenda de los Soles is explicit and specific about what ended it. Fire fell from the sky. The text states that it rained fire on those who lived in the age of the 3rd sun. The fire came from above. The people who survived were those who transformed. The text describes transformation into birds, which Bierhorst notes identify as simultaneously a mythological motif and a physical description of people who climbed into tree canopies and survived sheltering above the ground level while fire fell and burned below them. The detail is worth dwelling on. Survival by climbing trees during fire rain from above describes a very specific physical scenario. You survive not by running horizontally, the fire is coming down. You survive by elevating yourself into the canopy and sheltering above the layer of ground-level fire. This is an oddly practical detail to preserve in a cosmological myth. The distinction between the 3rd sun and the 4th sun is structurally important. The Aztec calendar system did not treat these as variants of the same destruction. They are sequential, categorically distinct, and tracked by separate day sign markers. 4 rain, fire from above. The following age's destruction, flood, 2 different catastrophes, encoded in the most precise astronomical calendar in the pre-Columbian Americas. Alfonso Caso's reconstruction of the Aztec calendar correlation demonstrates that the calendar tracked astronomical cycles, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, to an accuracy within minutes of what modern instruments confirm. These were not casual mythmakers. These were rigorous observers of the sky. The 260-day ritual calendar embedded within the larger 365-day solar calendar, embedded within the 52-year calendar round, embedded within the 5,125-year long count. This is not a system built by people who were imprecise. When the same system records fire rain from the sky, ending an entire age of creation, it is recording something in the same register of seriousness as a Venus transit. Nahui Quiahuitzil, 4 rain, the rain that ended the 3rd sun. It fell from above, and those who survived it became birds. Number 7. The Celts in the summers of 1933 and 1934. V. Gordon Childe, at that point professor of prehistoric European archaeology at the University of Edinburgh, one of the most respected field archaeologists in Europe, conducted excavations at Finnavon Hillfort in Angus. Scotland, working alongside him, was Wallace Thornycroft, a metallurgist. Their findings were published in 1937 in the Proceedings of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. What they documented at Finnavon was a phenomenon that had been noted at other Scottish sites for over a century, but never systematically explained. The stone walls of the hill fort had been melted into glass. Vitrification, The stone, a mix of granite and sandstone rubble, combined with the timber framing typical of Iron Age hill fort construction, had been subjected to heat so intense that the material had fused into a single continuous mass. Not charred. Not cracked by thermal expansion. Fused, glass-like. Solid, Shield and Thornycroft took samples and submitted them for analysis. The minimum temperature required to produce vitrification in the specific stone composition at Fimbulwinter is approximately 1100 degrees Celsius. For reference, a modern industrial cremation furnace operates at 870 to 980 degrees Celsius. Structural steel begins losing its load-bearing capacity at around 500 degrees Celsius. The walls of Fimbulwinter Hill Fort were subjected to heat considerably exceeding what modern industrial crematoria achieve, sustained across the entire wall structure, not at a localized point. Fimbulwinter is not the only site. It is not even the largest. Ian Ralston, professor of prehistoric archaeology at the University of Edinburgh, has led the most comprehensive modern survey of what are now catalogued as vitrified forts. The count in Scotland alone exceeds 50 confirmed sites. Tapo Noath in Aberdeenshire, the vitrified mass covers the entire summit plateau, more than 1,000 square meters of fused stone. Craig Fadrig, near Inverness. Dunadir in Aberdeenshire. Carradall in Kintyre. The phenomenon recurs across the Scottish landscape, with smaller concentrations in Ireland and parts of northern France. Ralston, writing in 2006 in a survey of Scottish Iron Age hill forts, stated explicitly that the cause of the vitrification remains genuinely puzzling, and that the temperatures achieved exceed what current models of intentional burning can explain. This matters because intentional burning is the default explanation, enemies or the inhabitants themselves setting the timber-laced ramparts on fire to deny the site to an opponent. The problem is that this explanation has been tested. Experimental archaeology has repeatedly constructed replicas of timber-laced stone ramparts and set them on fire. The results are consistent. Conventional burning does not vitrify the stone. The temperatures don't reach 1100 degrees Celsius. The distribution of heat isn't uniform enough. The glass-like fusion of the stonework at sites like Tapo Noath cannot be produced by setting the walls alight with available combustibles. Something else produced these temperatures. What that something else was is genuinely unresolved in the scholarly literature. The Irish mythological text Cathmage Twyard, The Battle of the Plain of Pillars, contains, among its catalogue of divine war weapons, a spear called the Lewin of Kelchar. The weapon's defining characteristic is that it cannot be left in open air when not in use. It must be kept submerged in a cauldron of a specific liquid, because if it is exposed to air, it burns everything around it. Its fire cannot be extinguished by water. The text describes warriors killed not by being struck by the spear, but by its proximity, by the heat radiating from it. It is a weapon that kills through emission rather than impact. The vitrified hill forts and the Lewin of Selchar are not the same thing, but they exist in the same cultural memory and on the same landscape. The Celtic oral tradition preserved the concept of a weapon that produced unquenchable fire at a scale beyond any conventional combustion. The Celtic landscape preserves, at over 50 sites, physical evidence of temperatures that no one has reproduced experimentally. The vitrified walls at Tapo Noath have been sitting on that Aberdeenshire summit for somewhere between 2,000 and 2,500 years. The explanation for what produced them has not been settled. Number 6. The Chinese N279C. Workers excavating a sealed burial tomb at the town of Ji, in what is now Henan province in central China, broke through into a chamber that had been undisturbed since the 3rd century BC. Inside, they found thousands of bamboo slips, thin strips of bamboo, each inscribed with classical Chinese characters in black lacquer ink. Preserved in the sealed, undisturbed atmosphere of the tomb for approximately 550 years. The texts were still legible. Scholars who examined them realized they had found something extraordinary, a continuous year-by-year chronicle of Chinese history, running from the age of the mythological emperors through the period of the warring states. The chronicle is known as the Zhushu Jianian, the Bamboo Annals. The Bamboo Annals are not mythology, they are a chronicle. Year by year, entries recording reigns, military campaigns, astronomical events, natural disasters, and political transitions. The format is the same documentary format used in the official dynastic histories compiled by later imperial administrations, and in the reign of the Emperor Yao, placed in the 3rd millennium BCE in the traditional chronology. The chronicle records an event that does not resemble any standard entry in the dynastic record. 10 suns appeared in the sky simultaneously. The Huinanzi, a comprehensive philosophical and practical encyclopedia compiled around 139 BCE during the reign of Han Emperor Wu by Lu An, Prince of Huinan, provides the most detailed account. John S. Major of Columbia University published the authoritative English translation in 1993 through Sunny Press, a revised and expanded scholarly edition with Sarah Queen, Andrew Meyer, and Harold Roth was published by Columbia University Press in 2010. The Huinanzi is not a mythological text. It was compiled to advise emperors on cosmology, governance, natural philosophy, and military strategy. It is a statecraft manual. Its catastrophe narratives are not decorative mythology. They are historical context embedded in governance instruction. The Huinanzi's account of the 10 suns states the following. 10 suns rose simultaneously. The combined heat exceeded what the earth could endure. Crops died across the known world. Forests caught fire. The metal in weapons and tools melted where they lay. Stone melted. Rivers and ponds boiled. Famine swept across civilization and killed nearly all living things. The archer hero Ho Yi was commanded by the divine authority to address the problem. He took up a divine bow and shot down 9 of the 10 suns. One remained, the sun that still exists today. Major and his colleagues note in both editions that the 10 suns narrative shares structural features with related sky catastrophe texts in the Shanhai Jing, the classic of mountains and seas, a geographic and mythological compendium of extraordinary diversity, and with other accounts of unusual celestial events preserved in the classical Chinese corpus. The Shang Dynasty oracle bones from Anyang, the oldest surviving corpus of written Chinese, dated to approximately the 13th century BC, record extensive astronomical observations, including notations of unusual luminous phenomena in the sky. The physical description of what 10 simultaneous suns would produce, in the Huinanzi's framing, is a specific list of thermal effects: crop death, forest fire, metal liquefaction, stone liquefaction, boiling of standing water. These are not metaphors for drought. A drought kills crops. It does not melt metal and stone. The Huinanzi is describing a heat event of a scale and intensity several orders of magnitude beyond what a single sun produces. An event producing temperatures sufficient to liquefy materials with melting points in the hundreds of degrees Celsius across a wide geographic area for a sustained period. The Bamboo Annals are studied by sinologists and historians as a primary source document of extraordinary value. The Huinanzi is a major text of Han Dynasty intellectual history. Between them, they preserve, in their most serious registers, chronicle history and imperial statecraft advice, a description of catastrophic sky events producing thermal effects at a scale that mainstream physical science has not systematically investigated in relation to these texts. Quick one, if you haven't subscribed yet, this is a good moment. Hit the button. And drop a comment with where in the world you are and what time it is there. I read every single one. Back to it. Number 5. The Acadians' the year is 1845. Austin Henry Layard is 28 years old and has no formal archaeological training. He is the son of a civil servant, has taught himself Ottoman Turkish and Persian, and has spent years traveling through the Middle East on a shoestring. He has convinced the British consul Henry Creswick Rawlinson that the enormous mounds rising from the east bank of the Tigris across from the city of Mosul conceal the ancient city of Nineveh. Rawlinson secures minimal funding. Layard begins digging. What Layard finds exceeds anything anticipated. Below the mounds at Koyunjik, he uncovers the palaces of the Assyrian kings. And in the palace of Ashurbanipal, the last great king of Assyria, who ruled from approximately 668 to 627 BCE, Layard finds a room, and then more rooms, filled from floor to ceiling with clay tablets. Tens of thousands of them. Ashurbanipal had assembled a library, not in the accidental sense of a collection that accumulated over time, but in the deliberate sense of an imperial project to gather and preserve the entire literary output of Mesopotamian civilization. Scribes were sent to cities across the empire to copy whatever texts they could find. The result was the most comprehensive archive of ancient Mesopotamian literature ever assembled, containing texts that were already centuries or millennia old when Ashurbanipal's scribes copied them. Among those tablets are copies of a poem that scholars will eventually identify as one of the stranger documents in the ancient literary record. Its title, taken from its opening line, is Era Sharu Kakabu. Era is king. A star is king. It is known today as the Era epic. The poem runs to approximately 509 lines across 5 tablets. It describes a god named Era, the Akkadian deity of plague, violence, and mass destruction, who is persuaded by another deity, Isum, to unleash his weapon against civilization, and then persuaded again to stop before the destruction is complete. The Era epic names its author. This is remarkable in Mesopotamian literature. The colophon states that a man named Kapti Ilani Marduk, a Babylonian name, suggesting a cultic affiliation with the city of Babylon, received the text in a dream and wrote it down from memory upon waking. Luigi Cagni, the Italian Sumerologist, published the authoritative scholarly edition L'Epopea di Era in Rome in 1969. An English translation followed as The Poem of Era through Undana Publications of Malibu, California in 1977. Cagni's edition remains the scholarly reference for the text. What the Era epic describes about the functioning of Era's weapon is unlike anything else in Mesopotamian literature, and unlike anything else in the broader ancient Near Eastern literary corpus. The weapon does not impact. It does not burn in the conventional sense of fire spreading from a source. It is deployed from a single point, and it moves through the air. Not as a projectile that travels point to point, but as an expanding agent. The text describes it spreading outward from the release point. Cities that receive it are not described as burning. They are described as emptied. Everyone in them is gone, not soldiers, not just adult men, but civilians, children, the elderly, animals in their stalls. The land is left without people, the way a field is left without crops after harvest. Silent, empty, the most striking passage in the text is the shelter instruction. In the poem, survivors are told explicitly, go inside, seal your doors, remain within your buildings, and do not come out while Era's weapon is active in the air. This instruction is not attributed to folk wisdom or the practical experience of a survivor. It is stated as knowledge proceeding from a divine source that understands the weapon's mechanism. Go inside. Seal the door. Wait, this is the shelter-in-place instruction. Every modern radiological emergency protocol in the world, from nuclear plant accidents to dirty bomb scenarios, specifies the same procedure. Go inside, seal entry points, do not go outside, and wait for the airborne contamination to pass. The instruction in the Era epic predates those protocols by approximately 3,000 years. It is not a general instruction to seek shelter from an enemy army. Doors are not sealed against armies. They are sealed against something that moves through the air and enters through openings. The colophon of the Era epic adds one final element. It states that wherever this tablet is set up and displayed, in whichever city keeps a copy, that city will be protected from Era's weapon. The instruction is to distribute the text. Maintain copies. The protection is conditional on possession of the text. This is not a standard literary dedication. It is a survival clause. It functions as a treaty guarantee between the preservers of the text and the weapon it describes. The era epic is held in the British Museum, the Louvre, the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, and several major research university collections. Its shelter-in-place instruction, sealed indoors, wait for the airborne agent to clear, has no satisfying explanation in the standard scholarly literature. Number 4. The Egyptians, October 1817. Giovanni Battista Belzoni is standing in the Valley of the Kings. He is 6 feet 3 inches tall, a former Paduan hydraulics engineer who reinvented himself in London as a circus strongman before making his way to Egypt and discovering that no one was better at moving and extracting objects from ancient tombs than a man of his size, strength, and instinct for three-dimensional space. He has been working the valley for 2 years. Today, his workers have cleared debris from a sealed doorway in a cliff face on the west bank of the Nile. Belzoni forces the entry and crawls through a debris-choked passage. The torch he carries illuminates walls, painted walls, floor to ceiling, every surface covered in color and image and hieroglyphic text in extraordinary detail and preservation. He keeps going deeper, chamber after chamber. He measures and describes as he goes. The tomb is the largest he has yet encountered. 3,000 years of sealed air come out as he moves through it. He has found KV-17, the burial place of Pharaoh Seti I, father of Ramesses the Great, who ruled Egypt from approximately 1294 to 1279 BCE. Among the many texts painted on the walls of Seti I's burial chamber is one that scholars will not fully understand for over a century. When they finally translate and analyze it, they will find the same text, with minor variations, on the walls of 4 additional royal tombs, those of Ramesses II, Ramesses III, and Ramesses VI, and in partial form on a gilded shrine from the tomb of Tutankhamun. 5 royal tombs across 3 dynasties, spanning approximately 300 years. The text is called the Book of the Celestial Cow, and whatever it says, the pharaohs of Egypt wanted it with them when they went into eternity. Alexandre Pionkov, the French Egyptologist whose multi-volume translation of Egyptian royal tomb texts published through Princeton University Press, remains foundational. Provided the primary scholarly translations of the Book of the Celestial Cow in the 20th century. Erich Hornung, Professor Emeritus of Egyptology at the University of Basel, author of, among other works, Conceptions of God in Ancient Egypt, published by Cornell University Press in 1982, analyzed its theological implications in that volume and in subsequent work. Hornung is widely considered among the foremost living scholars of Egyptian religious thought. The Book of the Celestial Cow describes an event in mythological time. Humanity rose against Ra, the sun god, and Ra convened a divine council. The council deliberated. Ra decided to send the Eye of Ra against humanity, an agent or force that emanates from Ra and is sent forth to destroy. The text names this agent as Hathor, elsewhere identified with Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of war and destruction. But the theological identification matters less for our purposes than the physical description. The Eye of Ra does not strike individuals. It is not a weapon in the sense of a projectile or a blade applied to a specific target. It spreads. It descends from above. It moves across the land as a totality, not targeting soldiers or enemies or specific people, but operating across the landscape as a whole. It kills at scale, not a city, not an army, but humanity as a category. Those who encounter it die. The text describes the destruction beginning and proceeding. Hornung, in Conceptions of God in Ancient Egypt, identifies the Eye of Ra as an Egyptian theological concept he calls totalized destructive force. Force that is released rather than aimed, that operates across an area rather than at a point, that cannot be recalled once dispatched and continues operating on its own momentum. The distinction between directed violence and released force is, in Egyptian religious thought, theologically significant. Ra does not guide the Eye of Ra to specific individuals. He releases it. It operates independently. The destruction stops not because it runs out of targets or because Ra commands it to stop in the conventional sense. It stops because of physical intervention. The flooding of the land with red-dyed beer causes the Eye of Ra to consume the beer rather than the people, mistaking one for the other. The Eye of Ra is deceived into stopping. This detail implies a mechanism that continues operating independently and must be actively interrupted. It is not a weapon that stops when the wielder stops. It has its own inertia once released. 5 royal tombs, the most important funerary text in the Egyptian royal tradition across 3 dynasties. The description of a force dispatched from above that spreads across a landscape and kills without being individually directed, and that must be actively stopped before completion because it continues on its own once released. The pharaohs had it painted on their walls. No one has given a fully satisfying account of why. Number 3. The Hebrews in 1925. The Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago launched systematic excavation at Tel Megiddo under James Henry Breasted, the Egyptologist and historian who founded the Oriental Institute and coined the phrase Fertile Crescent. Megiddo controls the Megiddo Pass, the single most strategically significant land corridor between Egypt and Mesopotamia, where the coastal road from Egypt turns inland through the Carmel mountain range. Whoever controls Megiddo controls the movement of armies and trade between the 2 great river civilizations. The site has been fought over continuously for approximately 6,000 years, and the excavation proves it. 20 distinct occupation layers. Each one a complete civilization built on the ruins of the last, stretching from the Chalcolithic period through the Hellenistic. 20 destructions followed by 20 reconstructions. The name of the hill, in Hebrew, is Har Megiddo. Armageddon, the biblical prophetic texts that cluster around Megiddo and the Day of the Lord, a recurring category across multiple prophetic books. Describing a final destructive event of world-scale significance, do not describe siege warfare. They describe something categorically different from the military conquest layers that archaeologists identify in Megiddo's stratigraphy. Zechariah 14:12 is the sharpest case. The Hebrew word used is makak. The word means to dissolve, to melt, to liquefy. A physical process word describing the transition of solid matter to liquid or near liquid state. The verse describes what happens to the people struck. Their flesh will makak while they are standing on their feet. Their eyes will makak in their sockets. Their tongues will makak in their mouths. The sequence is explicit: flesh first, then eyes, then tongue. The person is still alive and standing during this process. The text specifies that they are standing on their feet while the makak proceeds. The dissolution is progressive. It begins at the periphery and moves inward. This is not a poetic description of death and battle. A sword strike, an arrow, a spear thrust, none of these produce progressive dissolution of flesh in a standing living person. The sequence that the word makak describes, peripheral tissue damage preceding organ involvement, in a conscious living person who remains upright through the onset, matches the clinical progression documented in modern medical literature on acute radiation syndrome, mucous membrane and skin damage preceding deeper organ involvement, with extremities and exposed surfaces affected before interior structures, in a person who may remain conscious and functional for hours or days before collapse. The progression from periphery to core in a standing living person is a specific pathological sequence. Joel 2:30 uses the Hebrew phrase timarot ashan. The root word is tamar, the date palm tree, whose shape is a tall, slender trunk topped by a spreading crown of fronds that extends outward in a roughly circular canopy. Timarot ashan is literally date palm columns of smoke, smoke that rises in a column and then spreads at the top. The visual described is a tall column of smoke rising and spreading outward as it reaches altitude. The Dead Sea Scroll fragment, designated 4QXIIA, recovered from Cave 4 at Qumran during the 1952 excavation season, contains the Joel text in a manuscript dated to approximately 150 BC, establishing that this specific phrasing long predates any modern influence. Isaiah 24:6 uses the Hebrew arar, to curse, to scorch bare, in the context of the earth's inhabitants being consumed by fire, with only a remnant surviving. 3 different men. 3 different centuries. Isaiah's ministry, dated by scholars to the 8th century BCE. Joel's dating disputed, most placements ranging from the 9th to the 4th century. Zechariah working in the 6th century, following the return from Babylonian exile. 3 prophets, 3 centuries. Describing the same event from 3 different vantage points. What they describe at the physical level is not supernatural in the sense of inexplicable. Progressive tissue dissolution in standing living people. Smoke rising in a column that spreads outward at the top. The earth scorched bare with few survivors remaining. Makak is not an abstract word. It is not a theological term. It is a physical process word. The flesh dissolves while the person stands. This is what Zechariah 14 describes. And the sequence, periphery first, then sensory organs, is not a guess or a metaphor. It is what happens to living tissue under a specific kind of exposure. Zechariah was writing what he had either seen or received reliable report of, and what he described was exact. Number 2. The Sumerians' the year is 1939. Samuel Noah Kramer is 42 years old and is working in the tablet room of the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, the Penn Museum, in Philadelphia. Kramer had spent his early career at the Oriental Institute in Chicago and at the Penn Museum developing the tools of Sumerology, the scholarly discipline of reading and translating Sumerian cuneiform, one of the most demanding fields in ancient studies because Sumerian has no known language relatives. It must be learned from scratch through the texts themselves. Kramer is one of perhaps 20 people in the world with sufficient command of Sumerian to work through an unknown text without a crib. He holds a clay tablet. Fired clay, approximately the size of a small paperback book, covered in the wedge-shaped impressions of Sumerian script. Pressed into wet clay somewhere in Mesopotamia, sometime around 2000 BC, fired to preserve it, surviving 4,000 years in the soil of what is now Iraq, before excavation, transport, and arrival in the collections of the Penn Museum. Kramer begins to read. The text is a lamentation, one of a genre of Sumerian poetic works mourning the destruction of great cities, Nippur, Sumer as a whole, composed in the aftermath of political catastrophe. But as Kramer works through the tablet, he finds something that stops him. A passage that doesn't match the standard conventions of the lament genre. He notes it. He publishes his translation in 1940 as Assyriological Studies No. 12 through the Oriental Institute of Chicago. The text, the lamentation over the destruction of is subsequently assembled in complete form from tablet fragments held in museums in Philadelphia, London, Baghdad, and Jena, Germany. Piotr Mikolovsky of the University of Michigan published the definitive scholarly edition. The lamentation over the destruction of Sumer and through Eisenbrauns in 1989 as part of the canonical lament series. The complete text is maintained in the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature, hosted at Oxford University. At its height under the Third Dynasty of roughly 2112 to 2004 BCE, the city of was one of the most powerful and wealthy cities in the world. Capital of an empire stretching across Mesopotamia. Home to the great ziggurat of Nana, the moon god, a 3-tiered step tower rising over 60 feet above the plain, visible for miles. A city of craftsmen, merchants, scribes, and priests living in 2-story mud brick houses arranged on planned streets, with a sophisticated drainage system and a harbor connected to the Persian Gulf by canal. The population of Greater at its height has been estimated at several 100,000 people. Then it was destroyed. The lamentation was composed to mourn that destruction, and it describes 2 separate causes. The first cause is clearly identified, the Elamites. A people from what is now southwestern Iran, the region around Susa and Persepolis, invaded, sacked, and occupied the city. This is historically corroborated. Other Mesopotamian records confirm the Elamite attack. It happened. The lamentation mourns it. But the lamentation is careful, and this carefulness is what Kramer noted to distinguish the Elamite invasion from something that came before it. The text calls the earlier event the evil wind, an Udug-hul, a malevolent force that came from the northwest. What the text describes about the evil wind is strikingly specific in ways that set it apart from any other description of destruction in the Sumerian literary corpus. The evil wind does not burn, it does not flood, it does not involve weapons or armies. It passes through walls, it moves through the enclosed interior of buildings. It reaches people who are sheltering indoors. It kills without leaving wounds. The text describes the dead of lying face down in blood in the streets, not slain by blades, not burned, not drowned, simply dead, in blood, with no external injuries visible on their bodies. The aftermath continues in the text with specific detail. Animals, dead. The fish in the canals and rivers, dead. Vegetation, dead. The wells of contaminated. The water described as undrinkable. The water supply of the city rendered unsafe. The image the text uses for the evil wind's passage through the city is of a cloak thrown over the land, a cover that descends and presses in from above and around simultaneously, reaching everywhere. Kramer wrote in his 1940 publication that the evil wind passage was unlike any enemy action described in Sumerian literature. He was working without a modern comparative framework for what he was reading. But the observation holds. The Sumerian literary corpus contains extensive descriptions of conquest, armies attacking walls, fire set to granaries, populations enslaved or killed by sword. The evil wind is not in that category. It is a categorically different description of a categorically different kind of destruction. The text is explicit about the sequence. Evil wind first, Elamite army second. The city was already emptied and silent before the Elamites arrived. The lamentation mourns both. But it treats them as different in kind, not merely in sequence. An invisible agent that passes through walls, kills without wounds, leaves the dead in blood without visible injury, contaminates the water supply, kills animals and fish and vegetation, and arrives from a specific direction on the wind. This is not a description of fire, or disease in the ancient literary sense, or military action. It is a specific cluster of effects. They correspond as a cluster to what modern physical science calls the dispersal of a radiological or toxic aerial contaminant, penetration of shelter, lethality without wound, water and food contamination, broad biological toxicity, directional arrival. The people of were lying face down in blood in the streets of the richest city in the world, no wounds on their bodies. After something came out of the northwest and moved through their walls, and they were not the first civilization on this list to describe this. Number 1. The Indians' July 16th, 1945, 5:29 in the morning, mountain wartime. Jornada del Muerto, Journey of the Dead Man, desert in southern New Mexico. The steel tower standing on the flat alkali plain has been constructed in total secrecy over a period of months. At its top sits a device assembled by several thousand of the most brilliant scientists and engineers in the world, working for 3 years under military security in facilities across the United States and Canada. It weighs approximately 10,000 pounds. It contains approximately 14 pounds of plutonium-239. The theoretical yield predicted by the physicists at Los Alamos is somewhere between 5 and 30 kilotons of TNT equivalent. No one is certain. Some of them have made private bets on whether it will work at all. Robert Oppenheimer, scientific director of the Manhattan Project, is watching from an observation post 6 miles from the tower. The detonation happens. The fireball expands to approximately 1 mile in diameter in the first second. The temperature at the center of the fireball reaches approximately 10 million degrees Celsius, hotter than the interior of the sun. The shockwave arrives at the observation post 30 seconds later. The mushroom cloud rises to over 7 miles in altitude. The stem expands. The cap spreads outward at altitude. 20 years later, in 1965, NBC filmed Oppenheimer for a documentary. The interviewer asks what he and his colleagues thought when the bomb detonated. Oppenheimer pauses, then says, "We knew the world would not be the same." A few people laughed, a few people cried. Most were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that, one way or another. And then Oppenheimer adds a qualifier. In modern times? Yes, in modern times. Yes, the Bhagavad Gita is embedded within the 6th book of the Mahabharata, the great Sanskrit epic whose complete text runs to approximately 100,000 verses. For scale, the combined length of the Iliad and the Odyssey, in Greek, is roughly 27,000 lines. The Mahabharata is approximately 4 times longer than both combined. It is not a folktale. It is the central document of Hindu civilization combining theology, philosophy, dynastic history, and military science in a single vast structure. Kesari Mohan Ganguly, a Bengali scholar working entirely without institutional support, completed the first full English translation, published in serial installments between 1883 and 1896. The translation runs to 12 volumes. Ganguly worked from the Sanskrit for over a decade. His edition remains the standard reference for the complete text. The Mahabharata contains many weapons. Most are conventional: swords, bows, spears, chariots. Some are supernatural, weapons of fire, of lightning, of wind. But one class of weapon receives treatment unlike any other in the text. It is described in 2 specific books, the Drona Parva, which covers the military campaigns of the teacher Drona, and the Saptika Parva, the Book of the Sleeping Warriors, which describes its actual deployment. The weapon is the Brahmastra. The Brahmastra is described as the weapon of Brahma, the creator deity. It is distinguished from all other weapons in the text by the specificity and consistency of its physical description across both books. Here is what the Mahabharata says the Brahmastra does. It is released from a single point, typically from a specific ritual invocation, focused on a single location. As it rises through the atmosphere, it expands. The expansion is compared in the text to the opening of a parasol, a central point from which the deployment spreads radially as it ascends. It produces heat described as equal to 10,000 suns. Upon detonation, the air itself becomes dangerous. The text states that the air in the affected region is poisonous and must not be breathed. Food and water within the affected area are contaminated and must not be consumed. Women who are in the region and are pregnant give birth to children with physical deformities, or do not give birth at all. Those who survive the initial event but remain in the affected region lose their hair and nails in the days following exposure. Rivers in the region alter their courses. The land itself remains affected. The contamination persists in the earth and does not recede quickly. The text describes attempts by other warriors to counter the Brahmastra once deployed, and notes that countering it incorrectly will cause the very attempt to intensify the destruction. Let us be precise about what these details describe, taken individually. Single point release followed by radial atmospheric expansion. The visual of a parasol opening describes an explosion that releases energy in a sphere expanding from a central point, which is what a fission or fusion detonation does. Thermal yield of 10,000 suns. The temperature at the center of the Trinity fireball was 10 million degrees Celsius, roughly 10,000 times the surface temperature of the sun. Post-detonation air contamination. The radioactive products of a nuclear detonation produce alpha, beta, and gamma radiation in the air, soil, and surfaces throughout the affected zone, creating an environment dangerous to breathe. Food and water contamination. Radioactive fallout deposits on food crops and water supplies, rendering them unsafe. This was documented in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, and is a standard component of nuclear effects doctrine. Fetal abnormalities and stillbirths. Exposure to ionizing radiation during pregnancy produces documented increases in fetal abnormalities, miscarriage, and stillbirth, confirmed across exposed populations from Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and Chernobyl. Delayed hair and nail loss. Acute radiation syndrome specifically damages rapidly dividing cells, including hair follicles and nail matrices, producing hair loss and nail loss as a delayed effect, typically beginning 7 to 10 days post-exposure in people who received sub-immediately lethal doses. River course alteration. A detonation of sufficient yield produces ground shock and seismic effects that have historically altered drainage patterns. Environmental persistence. Radioactive contamination from a nuclear detonation persists in soil and water for periods ranging from years to centuries, depending on the isotopes involved. Every one of these effects is documented in the modern scientific literature on nuclear weapons. Every one of them appears in the Saptaka Parva's description of the Brahmastra. The text was written, in whatever form preceded its current Sanskrit transcription, at minimum 3,500 years before J. Robert Oppenheimer and his colleagues identified these effects through physics, chemistry, and the empirical study of nuclear detonations. Oppenheimer's engagement with Sanskrit was not casual. His papers held in the Library of Congress document sustained engagement with Sanskrit texts throughout his career, including through the Manhattan Project years. He had read the Mahabharata in the original Sanskrit. He knew the Brahmastra description. When the mushroom cloud rose over New Mexico and he reached for the most accurate words available to him, the words that most precisely captured what he had just witnessed. He reached back 3,500 years and found a weapon description that matched what he had built. He did not say the bomb reminded him of mythology. He said, he remembered a line, and then he said in modern times. The qualifier is the entire argument. Mohenjo-daro, one of the two major cities of the Indus Valley Civilization, along with Harappa, was identified in 1922 by John Marshall, then Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India. Based on finds made by R.D. Banerjee, systematic excavation was subsequently conducted by Banerjee and then by Ernest Mackay. The city, located in what is now the Sindh province of Pakistan, was among the largest cities in the ancient world at its peak, approximately 240 acres, population estimated between 40,000 and 100,000. It was equipped with sophisticated infrastructure, a grid street plan, a municipal sewage system, standardized fired brick construction, a granary complex, and a large public bath. It was abandoned around 1900 BCE. The abandonment appears sudden in the archaeological record. No evidence of gradual population decline. No systematic dismantling or looting of the infrastructure before departure. What the excavators found in the streets and buildings of Mohenjo-daro were skeletal remains, not interred, not arranged. Scattered, found in family groupings within the ruins of houses, in streets, in open public spaces, in positions suggesting people fell where they stood over a relatively short period across a wide area of the city. The skeletons show minimal evidence of the trauma typical of military conquest, few embedded weapons, little patterning consistent with mass execution. They appear to have died in place. Claims about elevated radiation readings at Mohenjo-daro, attributed to Davenport and Vincenti in publications from the 1970s, have not been confirmed by peer-reviewed radiometric archaeology. Those claims should be treated with significant caution. They belong in the unverified category. The archaeological evidence of unusual mass death without conventional destruction markers stands independently of those unverified claims and is documented in the mainstream literature of Indus Valley archaeology. What does not require those unverified radiation readings to be significant is this. The Saptaka Parva of the Mahabharata describes, in specific clinical detail, a weapon whose post-detonation effects, progressive hair and nail loss in survivors, fetal abnormalities, contaminated food and water, land persistence, air toxicity, were not identified by Western medicine as a coherent syndrome until August 1945, when physicians treating survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki observed these effects and began documenting them as acute radiation syndrome. The ancient Sanskrit text describes the same syndrome, in the same sequence, 3,500 years earlier. Either the author of the Soptica Parva had access to reliable empirical observation of a weapon producing these effects, or the description is coincidental at a level of specificity that defies probability. 10 civilizations. Norse fire from the sky producing winters without summers, with a climate signature preserved in Greenland ice cores. A Greek philosopher's account of Egyptian priests treating the burning of the world as documented history, using precise astronomical vocabulary for the incoming object. Aztec fire rain that ended an entire age of creation, encoded in the most accurate astronomical calendar in the pre-Columbian Americas. Stone walls fused into glass at a 1,100 degrees Celsius across 50 sites in Scotland. With no experimental reconstruction able to replicate the temperatures. A Chinese imperial statecraft manual describing 10 simultaneous suns, boiling rivers, and melting stone, compiled to advise emperors not to entertain children. An Akkadian literary work naming its author and containing explicit shelter and place instructions for a weapon that spreads through air. An Egyptian funerary text copied across 5 royal tombs in 3 dynasties, describing a force dispatched from above that spreads across landscapes and must be actively interrupted to prevent total extinction. 3 Hebrew prophets in 3 separate centuries, describing progressive tissue dissolution in standing living people and smoke rising in a column that spreads at the top. In manuscripts confirmed by the Dead Sea Scrolls to predate the modern era by centuries. A Sumerian lamentation explicitly distinguishing conventional military attack from an invisible wall penetrating wind that killed without wounds and contaminated the water supply, with the Elamite army arriving second, after the city was already silent. And a Sanskrit epic whose description of a single weapon, its release, its expansion, its thermal yield, its air toxicity, its water and food contamination, its fetal effects, its delayed hair and nail loss, its land persistence, was recognized by the director of the Manhattan Project as the most accurate description he knew of what he had just detonated over the New Mexico desert. He said in modern times, he was the man who built the first nuclear weapon in recorded history, and he believed the description he was quoting referred to something older. The convergence of these 10 accounts does not constitute archaeological proof of nuclear weapons in antiquity. The physical evidence at sites like Mohenjo-daro and the vitrified hillforts of Scotland remains contested and requires additional rigorous investigation. What the convergence does establish, with reasonable confidence, is that 10 separate civilizations, on multiple continents, with no documented contact across most of those pairings, all preserved in their most serious literary, forms the memory of events with a consistent set of physical characteristics. Extreme heat capable of melting stone, dimming of the sky following the event, an invisible killing agent that penetrates shelter and leaves no visible wound, contamination of water and food, delayed biological effects, survival possible only by sheltering, sealed inside, or by being fortunate enough to be out of the affected area. Whatever these people witnessed, they all witnessed it, and every single one of them tried to tell us what it was. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now, and make sure to subscribe.